I call the honourable member for Hunter.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. And I rise to support the motion of the Prime Minister, his speech and the support provided by the Leader of the Opposition in the main chamber. It's very easy at this point in time in our history to wonder whether the world has ever been less stable. And there is some weight in that question, with conflicts now waging in the Middle East, including in Iraq and Syria, a number of conflicts on the African continent, what is developing as pretty much a state-on-state conflict between the Russian Federation and Ukraine, and of course here closer to home, very significant strategic tensions in our own region. But when we reflect back to the 19th and 20th centuries, we see, of course, a much more grave picture with up to 40 million lives lost during the 20th century, mainly in the First and Second Wars, but also in conflicts like Korea. And of course, if you go back to the 19th century, the list is very long. Various revolutions and wars of independence, Franco-Prussian War, the War of 1812, the Anglo-Afghan War, the Anglo-Zulu War, Sino-Japanese War, the Boxer Rebellion, the Boer War, Crimean War. The list is very, very long. Things have thankfully changed as we've made our way into the 21st century. I don't know that human nature has changed much, but certainly I think we've matured as human beings, and we do have a far more developed international and rules-based systems which help us and guide us through periods of strategic tension and difficulty, and indeed the outbreak of conflict. But that is not to say that we can rest on our laurels. We have to be forever vigilant to ensure that we secure what the whole global community wants, and that is a peaceful world in which we can all live in peace. So these are serious times, and Australia has to be very cautious about the role it plays as not only a middle power, but a middle power which has quite successfully in recent years enhanced its role as an international player in the global community. And we should tread very cautiously as we deal with each of these questions which are before us. I think it's fair to say that there are a number of questions we need to ask ourselves before committing ourselves to military operations. First of all, whether the action is supported broadly in the international community, and of course whether the action is authorised by the country, the host country, the country involved, whether that military intervention is likely to do more harm than good, of course, whether there is a responsibility to protect, that is protection from things like ethnic cleansing and genocide, whether it is likely that the failure to act will lead to a proliferation and spread of fundamentalism and acts of terror, including on our own shore. And I think in the case of northern Iraq, all those boxes are ticked. And it is absolutely correct that Australia should be playing a part in an international coalition of forces to do all we can to secure a longer-term peace in that part of the world. Syria is a far more complex picture, and again, Australia will need to be very cautious about how it responds responsibly to questions which will inevitably emerge out of Syria. Australia will have to be very careful about concurrency issues here. We remain involved in military operations in a number of parts of the world, including still Afghanistan, now northern Iraq, and potentially, very potentially, if you can believe what the media is reporting today, Ukraine. And Australia has somewhat a limited capacity. We are very fortunate to have one of the best defence forces in the world, and I pay tribute to the men and women of the Australian Defence Force who in any way is already playing a role in some of these points of tension around the world, or who will play a role at some point in the coming weeks and months. But it is difficult for a small force like Australia to be participating in more than one operation, let alone 3 or potentially 4 operations. And we do need to be cautious, and we do need collectively in this place to commit ourselves to spending at least 2% of GDP on our defence forces, at least 2% of GDP, and do it more quickly than the current government currently plans to do. That's not a criticism in any sense, it's just a show of support from me, and I hope many in the Labor Party that that aspiration is a very important one, and one which we need to meet as quickly as is possible. I just want to say something else about Ukraine. Ukraine, on any measure, is emerging as a state-on-state conflict. And state-on-state conflicts are somewhat different than humanitarian responses we're seeing typically now in Iraq. They're not counterinsurgencies per se, but a very different beast, and many Australians, quite rightly, ask questions about the merit of our participation in Afghanistan. I, as a minister at one point, and of course in every position I've held in this place, have argued those merits, and I think they were very, very solid. They were very solid reasons for us to be in Afghanistan, and I absolutely believe we did the right thing to be participating in Afghanistan. But you can imagine the weight of the questions coming from people if we were to involve ourselves in what is effectively a state-on-state conflict so far from our shores and so far from our immediate sphere of influence. And you can imagine how weighty those questions would become if we were to lose more lives in Ukraine, which of course we've already so tragically done. I want to say something about parliamentary authorisation of military operations. I reject it. We are a strong and robust democracy. We have strong conventions which remain unchallenged in this place with respect to these issues. The people who sit on our National Security Committee of the Cabinet are duly elected people of the Commonwealth of Australia, in that sense expressing hopefully the will of the Australian people. They are people who have access to intelligence and other information, of course, which is critical to making these very, very tough decisions, information which could not possibly be made available to members of the broader Parliament, including the House of Representatives and the Senate, of course. I recall being at a meeting of NATO ministers in Scotland in very late 2007. These were ministers from so-called Regional Command South, who used to meet as a bit of a caucus, and having the then Dutch Defence Minister asked me to face his cameras, which were parked outside the NATO headquarters, so that I could make an appeal to his Parliament to reauthorise Dutch operations in Oruzgan province, where of course we were a critical partner. I don't think that is a good process. I think we do have to have trust and faith in our leadership to make these right decisions, and generally speaking, when the decisions are made correctly, they will typically have the broad support of the Parliament, as I know this Prime Minister has with respect to Iraq. Very quickly, Mr Deputy Speaker, we are not a member of NATO, nor should we be a member of NATO. We're happy to be a NATO partner, as we were in Afghanistan, where the merits present themselves, and we need to be always demanding that when we are participating, that we are part of the strategic planning process and have access to all the relevant information. But we need to be very cautious about how much we become engaged with NATO and their spheres of responsibility, because here, close to home, we need to ensure we don't take our eye off the very real strategic tensions in our own region.
I thank the member